Well, welcome everyone to our conversation on queering the workplace. I bet many of you are actually joining us from a little break from your new workplaces at home, like myself. So I really wanted to start this conversation talking about how our workplaces have changed over the last 2 years. I'm here at home. For the last 2 years, I've been working at home. Now I spend a few days in the office. But I wanted to ask my fellow panelists, Veronica, what does work and what does your workplace look like today?
Yeah, funny enough, I've actually been working from home way before the pandemic. I was working remotely with Bitch Media. They were headquartered in Portland, so I was working remotely anyway. So I was pretty prepped for this. But I just have a small office in my home, and navigating the virtual world, and just like everyone else. But yeah, I mean, I didn't have too much of a transition, but I feel like been missing the in-person time with folks, and having time to really connect face to face. Now that's kind of opened up a bit more for all of us. But
Yeah. And John, you look like you're somewhere really sunny. Is that a home office, work office? What does workplace look like to you today?
Workplace looks a lot like home. So Stitch Fix is one of the companies that went remote, and even as offices start to open up, people who weren't remote before had the option, and I chose to stay remote. Actually, it was my first time experiencing that, and it turns out I can get so much done when things are a little bit quieter around me. I am also one of the many people who was diagnosed with ADHD over the pandemic, and so how my working style has evolved has been sort of a confluence of those two things: the switch to remote and also learning a little bit about myself and what it takes to focus. And so it's had some unexpected positive impact on the way I work and my experience of work, but it also comes with its challenges.
Let's get into that, actually.
Yeah.
So I think for many people, not all people, working now means looking at your colleagues on a screen or chatting with them on Slack or Teams. And that both presents opportunities and challenges. But specifically as a queer person, and I'll continue with you, John, how has that experience changed the way that you either present or show up to work every day? How has building community among other queer coworkers changed as a result of primarily being on the internet?
Yeah, well, I mean, I have always been primarily on the internet. I am extremely online, and I came of age and came out at a time when the digital transformation was already sort of underway. It was planetout.org and gay.com back then. But the internet has always been really central to my experience of queer community. So in some ways, it hasn't changed in that regard. When it comes to community at work, it's obviously a little bit different. You don't have that sort of visibility across people outside of your immediate sphere anymore, right? Like you used to be able to go into the cafeteria and be like, you over there with the cold brew, you are also queer and I'm going to be your friend now. So that's a little bit harder, but we've, been finding digital equivalents. I think we've got the hashtag LGBTQ channel in our Slack, and so we're definitely adapting, and I think queer people adapt pretty well.
That rings true with me so much, because I was an AOL Instant Messenger kid on all of these different forums, and in many ways found a more authentic version of myself online. And I've become very comfortable working at home. But I also know that for a lot of people, losing that physical kind of community is really difficult. I want to turn to you, Veronica. I know you've also, you just mentioned primarily work remotely now.
Yeah.
Do you feel like anything is lost or was lost in that transition in terms of community building, solidarity, or just getting to know other queer people in the workplace?
I mean, I think like, John stated, there was always that sense of, walking down the hallway and the head nod with another queer person. But, I too was also looking for queer designers online, really. I think, more through Twitter. That's how I discovered Queer Design Club, years ago, was really like, who else is out there? Because oftentimes, especially if we work in small spaces, and I've often worked at, I've worked at large companies and I've worked at smaller companies. And in the small spaces, a lot of times you might be one of two or the only one. And so trying to find folks that align. And also the reality is like, not every queer person that you encounter at work is going to be the type of queer person that you want to hang out with. So trying to find other commonalities besides just, our queer identity was something I would always look for online.
Right. Well, and just going off of that, I think there's obviously an intersection of talking about your queer identity and also your gender identity and those dynamics that often in some ways reproduce in the virtual spaces, unfortunately. And Veronica, you are a femme presenting person. Your pronouns are they, them. How has that dynamic and the kind of systems around you that reinforce good and bad things, how has that changed in going to hybrid? Are things better? Have things gotten masked and are actually revealed in different ways? What are those intersections like?
Yeah, I mean, I think something that I found about, not being in actual physical spaces is I've noticed more of the gender dynamic that happens when you have large groups of people, where oftentimes femme presenting folks go hang out with each other and masculine presenting folks hang out with each other. While I am femme presenting, I, identify more masc of center and identify as butch. And I've always kind of been the person that has gone more into the masculine spaces. It's kind of nice not having to navigate those on a daily basis, being aware of the way in which your body physically navigates those rooms sometimes is really, can sometimes be tiring. And I think just the reality of being able to be yourself on a day-to-day basis, in a virtual space and in a physical space has changed because of COVID. I think that a lot more people feel a little bit more comfortable on a virtual space.
And I think some of those themes do come out in the queer design count, really, particularly among folks who are gender non-conforming or trans, that simply the energy it takes to be observed every day is a heavy one. And it often means the absence of that you don't really notice until you have the chance to kind of experience that. And I'm hearing a little bit of that in what you just described. And going a little bit further back in your career, you've worked at Bitch Media, a place that really proudly and it stakes its brand on a feminist response. And I'm curious, was that really important to you to seek out a place to work that had such a public stance and a public brand that was inclusive and aligned with your values?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I've been working in the field for 25 years. I've been out for all 25 of those years, and I've been in some spaces that have been very welcoming. I've been in spaces that have been very straight dominant, very cis dominant, male dominant, in a way that has really either marginalized my identity or at times put unwanted attention on that identity, ones that I didn't want to have to navigate while trying to do my job. So, you know, I ran my own studio for about 10 years and was really freelancing, getting to pick and choose the clients that I was working with. When the opportunity came along to work at a place like Bitch, I made that decision to go back in-house after several years of doing my own thing and being able to like navigate those spaces on my own. And working at a place that was, you know, with feminist values. I mean, the reality was that it was, you know, there was a lot more queer people that worked there. I had never actually worked at a space that had so many queer folks there. Very small team, and there was only 12 of us, so very tight knit. But cultural fit is really, you know, the most importance to me.
Yeah. And John, I know that you similarly, in just looking at the arc of your career, are drawn seemingly to the places that have really strong kind of public, a public commitment to issues about diversity, equity, inclusion. Stitch Fix, where you are now, really broadcast those on their website. But I'm curious, the public view of something often isn't the same thing as the true experience of working at the place. How have those values been experienced as an employee to you? Do you think as a designer they're reflected in your work? Do you feel like you need to challenge those often? Yeah, what is the internal, external experience there?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm definitely drawn to places that have sort of a public stance around inclusion or social impact. You know, I started in the nonprofit space and have found that that's a really key factor in whether or not I'm going to be fulfilled by the work. But yeah, you often don't know until you're in an environment how that public stance translates. I've definitely been in places that have taken really sort of grand framing for their mission, and you get into the nuts and bolts, and the way they're approaching it is actually super toxic. But my decision to join Stitch Fix was actually really heavily influenced by the culture, just getting the sense of sort of the inclusiveness of the team coming through in the interview process was one of the things that really sold me on joining. And it's one of the reasons why I've stayed as long as I have. I'm about to celebrate my 3-year anniversary. I think there's a real sense of openness for people to be themselves and also to have really difficult conversations. And like we've had an abundance of difficult conversations, I think, just as a company, like all other companies in the last few years. And I do, you know, I see our leadership really working to align its intent around DEI, which has been sort of in its stated culture for a long time, with, you know, impact and doing more of the work. We have a DEI team that's, you know, I think maybe about a year old, but doing some really important things around the way the company operates. That's not just messaging, which I really appreciate. But it is a process, and I think, like, as a designer, your whole job is really around aligning intent and impact. You know, and it's usually sort of a project, but I also think that that's an important role that designers can play inside a company. And so I'm always pushing us to be more inclusive. I think, you know, one thing that I really believe strongly is that you have to extend your corporate values of inclusivity to your clients and your customers, as well as your colleagues. If you're not building inclusive designs, you're not really living that value to its fullest extent.
John, on that, what do you know, if you're someone now who's, you know, looking to work somewhere that has these values, and you know, over the last several years, more and more companies, whether or not they work in a certain social justice space, have put forward public, right, values, and it seems a little bit harder. Well, it seems harder and harder every day to really decipher, like, what is just kind of lip service and what is a real culture if you were talking to someone now who's interviewing at places or looking at different jobs and looking at corporate websites, what should they be looking for? Should they just be looking at those values pages? Is there something in the design work that they can kind of glean some of these values from? How do you kind of make your way through all the noise to really find the true culture of a place?
Yeah, I mean, I think I usually look to people's comfort and willingness to answer difficult questions as sort of the best indicator of the strength of their culture, really pushing them, especially if you're interviewing in a place that has an established product that you can use. And, from the outside, you can find issues with the accessibility of it, or examples where it could be more inclusive to marginalized users. Bring that up in an interview and just see how they react. That can give you a lot of really important signal, just that one moment. It can tell you about the mindset that your potential coworkers are going to bring. It can also tell you about sort of the type of company that they're working within. If, for example, they sound really weary when they say like, oh yeah, we've been aware of that, but it's hard to make change on it. That's a place that can tell you that that's maybe a place where that work isn't being prioritized and designers are fighting uphill. Or if they feel really energized by your interest in that and like excited to have you as a partner to help tackle some of these things, that's also a really good sign, whether or not, they were aware of it before. I always,
John, you said that, this idea of hearing from someone who's weary, and it's funny because I think I've been that person. I've been the weary person on the other side of the interview. I've worked at, nonprofits. I've worked on presidential campaigns and newsrooms and all of these places that I've really admired because they had such important kind of social missions, but ultimately often find myself disappointed or feeling like it's not going far enough. Mm-hmm. Not every queer person who works somewhere wants to be a political mover and shaker within their organization. They just want to make really awesome work, and that is perfectly fine. But I think there's this, especially in the last few years, these conversations about forming boundaries, because I think it's hard to separate yourself politically from what's happening in the world these days. And many companies are actually grappling with how employees should engage with issues of racial equity or racial justice or LGBTQ rights, abortion rights most recently. And when do you kind of step back and take care of yourself? And so, the weary employee, right? The weary kind of mid-level staffer who's like in the ERG trying their best to make policy changes. I know you've both been there, Veronica, back to you. In some places you've worked, like Ghost Note, it sounds like you've been able to more organically kind of find community. How does that even happen, right? How does that even happen if someone wants to participate in these spaces, feels a little bit nervous about stepping into something that is a hot topic, but still wants to have that community? How do you even go about that as a designer?
I mean, I think, at Ghost Note, it's very much been by design. I came on to essentially build most of my team. And so I've been lucky enough to be the one hiring and making those types of decisions. And, also I ended up at Ghost Note for a very specific reason was, I think looking at the mission, looking at the work that they produced, and also looking at the makeup of the company was very important to me. Are they just speaking diversity, or is it actually a diverse group? And what does diversity of thought look like as well? I think that's something that's really important because we can have these sort of homogenous spaces. So for me as a manager and as a leader, obviously visibility is a huge thing, but making sure that I'm creating a safe space for my team to come to me if something is not feeling right to them. We don't really have ERGs at Ghost Note. We're still a really small agency. We're about 25 folks. So we have a Slack group, but not an ERG per se. But really, I think it's about, making sure that you as a leader are sort of putting yourself out there, kind of making calling folks out on issues that you see, both whether that is internally or for a client, even if they're not being inclusive, if they're not thinking about things, how do we go beyond the surface, and how do we push our clients to tell really layered, nuanced stories. I think something that we do really well at Ghost Note, and part of why we do it is because we sort of make up the audience, is we tell really complex stories. And for me, I think about queering the workplace not just in the makeup of the people on my team, but queering as a mentality. We very much have had to design our own lives from the jump. We've had to figure out what things look like for us, and I think that kind of thought process is invaluable, and something that I want to encourage in anyone.
Yeah. I know, John, you do have an ERG, and for those folks who are watching, an ERG is an employee resource group. And I've been in some that have been really fun and about kind of party planning, and others that are much more about organizing around healthcare benefits. All of that is work. All of that is work outside of your primary job. But at a place like Stitch Fix, John, where it is a bit more organized, or kind of sanctioned, whatever that means, from the bosses, how does that work look? Is that always a space that you find that anyone who's queer can join, or does it still kind of feel like it's for a specific kind of queer person? Say a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, Stitch Fix does have an ERG program. We call them communities. That is one of the earliest things that the DEI team that I mentioned took on, and I think they did a really great job. So community leads at Stitch Fix are compensated for the work that they put into it, which I think is really important, because, like you said, ERGs can be a lot of work, and they can become uncompensated labor for members. I think they serve a really important purpose. It is a benefit that in the Queer Design Count reports we've seen makes people feel more included at work and can reduce bias, and is a benefit in and of itself. But there is a real diversity. I think, ERGs serve a slightly different function than just community, right? Like, I actually don't participate in our ERG very much. When there are Pride events, or they need writers for the newsletter, I might chip in, but I have a pretty strong queer community within Stitch Fix outside of the ERG. And so if you're a company wanting to offer an ERG, I think it's really important to think about what's the actual substance of it beyond like those social connections, which can be important. But I think ERGs, it's much more important that they have mechanisms to actually advocate for marginalized employee groups. And if you're joining an ERG, I also think it's important to remember that ERGs are separate from an informal queer community. They really are an extension of the company. And that can affect what you expect of them. Some companies really do just think of the ERG as like a party benefit. The queer ERG is going to host a pride party, and that's going to be a nice little bonus. And if you try to use that ERG to get better trans healthcare, it's not going to go anywhere. And so I think that's just a really important nuance to keep in mind as, more and more companies try to invite people, especially queer people, to be their full selves at work, that there is still a really clear boundary that the company is always going to be mindful of. And, it's just smart for us to be mindful of that as well, so that we don't find ourselves, burning ourselves out trying to sort of change things from the inside and doing a lot of unpaid labor if the company on the other end of that ERG is not receptive to it.
Right, and I know both of you are managers and you manage teams, and you hinted at this, John, in that some of the results of the survey, the Queer Design Count, folks have really raised safety physically and emotionally as concerns as being a queer person in a workplace. Things like being misgendered in the workplace or not having boundaries between superiors. Many of these issues they're entrenched, they're systemic, they're much bigger than one company, and they're exhausting to think about and work on, particularly if you are the person who is affected by it. So as people who manage potentially other queer people, and maybe I'll start with you on this one, Veronica, like, how do you coach someone through those issues? How do you help them set boundaries? How do you set boundaries yourself when you care deeply about these issues, but also one person or even a handful of people at a company can't really affect that much change?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to think through what your goals are. And sometimes your goal is community. Sometimes your goal is to really, have other people that understand the fight and understand what you're struggling with. And other times you really are trying to enact real, change within company culture. I really try to encourage folks to think through, what the goals are, what they're trying to get, what kind of energy you really want to put in it, and what is it worth for you? What is it costing you? Physically and emotionally. I think that every company has its blind side. Everybody messes up. We all mess up, and it's really about, like, how do we handle that? Like, can we come to a real conversation? Are you being heard? I'm not a big fan of encouraging folks to just keep knocking themselves up against a wall when that wall is not moving. I would encourage them to think through other avenues, other communities that they can join where they can make some real change. Because I think it's really disheartening to try to continue to push against change. And at a certain point, you have to say, is this something that's movable? And if it's not, then what is it doing to me? And what is a choice I need to make for my own health?
Yeah, and what I'm hearing there, Veronica, it is a bigger theme that has been talked about much more recently, which is particularly millennials, but I think a lot of other workers trying to create that space between their identity as a worker and their identity just as a person. I think because of the ways that our capitalism works and because of the ways that companies tend to communicate their values, we are in a generation of workplaces where we talk about we are a community, you are a family, we represent all these things. And to your point, John, once something real like inclusive trans healthcare comes up, all of a sudden, everyone goes quiet, right? So have you found as managers, those conversations happening more? Have you found other outlets to direct that energy towards? Our work is not our life, but it is often where we spend the most amount of time every week. How have you mentored your, John, maybe this is a question for you, but how have you mentored folks on your team to create some of that space, to know that community and queer community doesn't always have to be loud activism at work, but can also just mean quiet, safe spaces to do the thing that you are passionate about? As a manager, I guess, is my question. How have you kind of advised people on your team about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Veronica mentioned something that sort of resonated with me, just like helping people pick their battles and really helping them think through the goals and really coaching them through navigating organizational change, because changing how a company works is different from, making a decision with a friend group, right? It's a lot of work. But I do think it's really important to also step back from that. I think I am a strong believer that like who I am as a person is also who I am as a worker. And if you look at the issues that people are dealing with, if you work with queer people, you have people who are spending their weekend reading tweets where their basic rights are being debated, and they're not going to be able to set that aside when they hop on Zoom, right? And so you have to, as a manager, really take your team's psychological safety as one of your top concerns, and really make it a priority. When the Roe v. Wade decision came out, I told my team to just take the day, right? Take 2 days, take, the day, the weekend, the Monday following if you need it. I don't think it's reasonable to expect people whose, basic personhood has just been set back 50 years to spend the day in Figma or, answering questions on Slack. I think we really just have to make the space for that. And I've found that one of the most important things I can do as a manager in that regard is to also give myself the same space. I really believe that people should be taking care of themselves, and I am in a unique position where if I take care of myself and I'm really open about what I'm doing, that sends a really strong message that that's okay at that company and on my team. And so that's definitely something that I've been trying to get better at. It has not been a historic strength of mine, but just saying to the team, hey, the news really sucks. I'm really struggling. I'm gonna take the day. Please do the same. Or if it's the next weekday we get together after we've all taken some time, just saying it still really sucks, right? This is not a mental health day is going to fix all of this. But here's my commitment to, what we're going to do together. Right.
Right.
So, yeah.
It sounds like, often we talk about queering the workplace as this very active thing that we're doing. But often it can also just mean surviving. It could also mean taking care of each other by not discussing the latest issues. That I think we don't talk enough about that, because it feels like if we don't participate, we're not moving things forward. But it is impossible, I think, for any one person to shoulder, particularly in the last few months, but obviously the last few years, the kinds of attacks we've had on our communities. And I know for, queer community is actually really broad. And I think some of the conversations we've talked about make me think that in some ways it's a microcosm of the larger queer community. There is not one queer community. And at companies, there are people who feel that moving the company forward is the best way to create change. And there are ways to do that unofficially. Are there ways that you've built solidarity with other communities in your workplaces, other ERGs? Veronica, I know you have a smaller workplace, but when have those moments been shared with other communities? We talked about the intersections of gender and queer identity, and many of the issues that affect queer workers are intersectional. Do you have, what has that experience been like for you in kind of building solidarity among other communities at work?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not, like you said, it's not a monolith. I think it's there are many queer communities, and I think also, being a Latinx, non-binary, also all of those things sort of come into my community. And I think, making really space for nuanced conversation and for us to really learn from one another is always important. Making sure that we, take time to know each other as people, as not just as our titles. But I do, like John said, really try to lead by example and talk about what's going on and feelings as is appropriate, of course. But to show that I'm human and that things affect me as well. And that, you can't just soldier on all the time. So I think that that's really crucial.
Right. I know we have a little bit of time left for audience questions. So I want to make sure we get some of those into, because they're actually really relevant to what we were just talking about. John, I want to direct this one to you. We have someone essentially asking, what if the business interests of the place you work don't align with the kind of progressive values that the company may kind of espouse publicly? And you talked about design systems and actually working within the business case, right? So have you ever experienced when you've received or worked on a product decision or a business decision that just doesn't quite feel like it aligns with those values? And how do you pick those battles?
Constantly. Yeah, I mean, I think I think that it's a really real challenge as designers. You're trying to influence people's behavior, and sometimes that can take you to places that maybe like are outside of your comfort zone and start to feel like maybe this isn't the right thing to do. And for me, I think business constraints are one of the hardest constraints designers face. And if something is really core to your company's business model, that is the type of thing that gives me pause. Like if this thing is essential to the future of my business, what am I actually going to be able to do to change that? Is a really hard question. And that's one of the few questions that, has led me to leave places in the past.
Well, on that, John, because I think there's a question that kind of directly follows that up, which is someone asking, when is it worth the energy to do that work at an organization, or should you just go somewhere else that you think already has demonstrated that commitment? What is the point for you when you're like, actually, this is taking too much of my energy? Why am I trying so hard if I can just be somewhere that is further along in that process? What is that limit for you? Where is that line in the sand for you?
Yeah, I have basically three things that I ask myself whenever I'm considering if I should stay at a job. And one is, do I believe in the value of what I and my colleagues are trying to accomplish together? Do I believe in my own ability to get us closer to that? And do I trust them to uphold their end of the bargain? And as long as the answer to those three questions is yes, we're good to go. I think there is this additional question: if you're somewhere where you're actively causing harm until you fix this issue, that you have to deal with, right? Like if the answer is maybe I can make things better, but in the meantime, I'm going to be contributing to a harmful system, that's not something personally that I would stick around through. Right. But for the most part, it's those three questions for me. And well,
Veronica, you've worked in music and publishing and advertising, and those have vastly different cultures. And I'm curious what your answer for that would be, because I think the tolerance in certain industries may be higher or lower. How have you compared those?
I mean, certainly they all have very different flavors. Advertising it has been very different. I think I've been lucky in, music and publishing, particularly publishing that I've worked in, which has been more cultural lifestyle publishing, working at Black Books. Surface has been, been more open. I've found advertising to be very, very straight, very straight, very cis, very invested in particular paths, much more immovable in my experiences, I found. But I think, you know, something that's also that I feel like is really important to address is the privileged position that we're in, you know. Do you need that job? Do you need to continue to get paid? What is your safety net like? Do you need the health benefits? I think there's definitely a question of, you know, am I contributing to harm? But I think there's also, you know, an acknowledgement of like, not everybody can quit and walk away when they want to. And sometimes it's a negotiation. Sometimes, you know, I've found myself going into agencies for 4 or 5 month sprints where it's been really tough, but I've gone in and I've done my job and I've kept my head down and I've cashed my checks. And I've done that with my eye on the prize for what I want to do outside of that, because it's fed into my art practice, or it's fed into something that is helping me launch a project that is much more meaningful to me. So I think it's always nuanced, and it's always really personal decision.
Right, nuance. I think that is kind of the theme I'm hearing. Is it's hard. There's a lot of things to consider. You know, that will be my last question to both of you because we're out of time, but this has been such a thoughtful conversation. I think we are actively reimagining what work and workplaces look like every day. So thank you both to Veronica and John for the chat today, and to the folks watching, if you're in your workplace, to tune back in. And I appreciate you, and thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.